Today on Don't Talk TV, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that I think is on a lot of people's minds. It's certainly all over the media, and that being the war between Russia and Ukraine, with a few defense lawyerly thoughts for viewers to consider when thinking about that conflict. Hello, my name's Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. So although I've branched out to practice in other areas such as constitutional law and human rights law and military law, the bulk of my career has been spent as a criminal defense lawyer. And as a criminal defense lawyer, and as with law in general, the facts are always hugely important, and part of determining what the true facts are is looking at both sides of the story. That's why we have defense lawyers, so that you have someone who's willing to put forward the conflicting facts or the other side of the story, even for the most discredited, disliked, or even hated individuals. So it's with that background, I want to take a look at the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine that's going on right now. It's been 3 weeks since Russia invaded the Ukraine. Viewers have certainly seen the pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia side to the story. Now, I don't purport to put in a pro-Russia side. I'm not entirely sure what Russia's side is, and I'm not interested in presenting pro-Russian propaganda. But what I do want to do is look at who is it that we're defending. What are we defending when the media is encouraging people to take up arms and travel over to the Ukraine to fight in foreign legions, when sanctions are being put on Russia that are really going to negatively impact our own economy in a very bad way, and when we're being pushed to the brink of World War III, I think it's important to consider who's involved here. Who are we doing this for? Then I have a couple considerations just for looking at the war in general, and some hypotheticals of how might this play out if there were a hypothetical scenario similar involving the United States. So, first of all, who and what are we defending? Mainstream media is telling us we need to defend Western values. I've seen our Prime Minister and our Minister of Foreign Affairs say this. Frankly, I don't know what Western values means anymore. Is it the freedom to have your child coerced to take a experimental medical treatment in order to play sports? Is it the freedom for a whole segment of the population to not be allowed to travel, not be allowed out of the country? Is it the freedom for people who've declined a certain medical treatment to not be employed by the government or in the medical field or to receive a post-secondary education? So maybe if we look at the Ukrainian government, we can see what are these Western values that we're being asked to fight for. Sadly, one of the first things that comes to my mind when I think of the Ukraine, and I just wish to pause here to say the government of the Ukraine, not the people of the Ukraine, the government that runs that country, because I think there's a clear distinction. So unfortunately, one of the first things I think of is human trafficking. The Ukraine is one of the countries with the most human trafficking in the world, and I think it's important to note here that in 2008, the government of the Ukraine did not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. However, it was making significant efforts to do so. While there was little evidence of efforts to curb trafficking, complicity of government officials, and of concrete steps to promote and assist trafficking victims at the national level, local governments made some progress on victim assistance. The government also made modest but tangible progress in improving the punishment of convicted traffickers, prosecuting labor trafficking, training the judiciary, and carrying out prevention activities. But that aside, it sounds like the government there is making some progress. Not a lot. Ukraine remains notorious for the amount of human trafficking that goes on there, but let's look at who NATO says we're supporting. So here's a tweet that NATO promptly deleted, but it says, "All women and girls must live free and equal. This International Women's Day, we think of the remarkable women of the Ukraine. Their strength, bravery, and resilience are symbolic of the spirit of their nation." Look at the image in the top left of these four, and we see this young lady. She looks like she's got pretty sophisticated kit on, so I'm assuming this is an actual member of the Ukrainian military, not some militia person. And you may notice this symbol on her body armor. Let's just move in a bit closer to that. So you can see that symbol there. It's like a spoked wheel with a sun type of symbol in the middle. Why did NATO pull that down right away? Well, they took it down because that symbol is the Sonnenrad, or the Schwarze Sonne, or Black Sun, and it's a sun wheel type of symbol that's used by neo-Nazis in some strains of Satanism. The symbol's design consists of 12 radial sig runes, similar to the symbols employed by the SS in their logo. It first appeared in Nazi Germany as a design element in a castle at Wewelsburg, remodeled and expanded by the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, which he intended to be a center for the SS. And yes, NATO really did post that. I'll post a link to the Internet Archive where you can see that this post was really there before they deleted it. Then we have our own Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, tweeted this image of herself holding a banner with red and white on it that says Slava Ukraini. So what's the significance of the black and red in the phrase Slava Ukraini? Now we see this term Slava Ukraini all the time. It means glory to Ukraine, and the response is frequently glory to the heroes. Well, where does that come from? This is the battle flag of the UPA, or the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes is their slogan that they used. Now, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, they were a paramilitary force that operated in the Ukraine during World War II, specifically after the Nazis invaded, and they were collaborators with the Nazis. They also partook of ethnic cleansing, especially under the branch under a man named Stepan Bandera. My own grandmother's family were all massacred by the UPA in 1943. She and her sister survived because they had gone out for a walk that day, but when they returned home, everyone in their village had been massacred, including their parents. Now, there's no way that Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland doesn't know this history and doesn't know the significance of this banner that she had in front of her and that she appears to be touching in that photograph. Now, I think it's also worthwhile considering how did the current Ukrainian government come to power. I recommend that you Google Euromaidan. It's a series of protests starting in November of 2013 and carrying over into February of 2014 in the Ukraine that ultimately resulted in the toppling of the government, democratically elected government led by a man named Viktor Yanukovych. Now, I know a lot of people don't like Yanukovych. He was apparently pro-Russian. That's what a lot of these protests were about. But you read about it, it sounds kind of similar to something that just happened in Ottawa to a certain point. You hear about their makeshift barricade setup. They had kitchens, first aid posts, broadcasting facilities, stages for speeches, lectures, debates, and performances. Sounds a little bit like the Freedom Convoy. However, they also had armed militia who patrolled the area and who fought back when the police arrived. And you can see a number of images here from various news sources where they fought back. They threw Molotov cocktails, they threw bricks, they burned military vehicles, and they broke into government buildings, and eventually this led to the overthrow of Yanukovych and the institution of a new government that led to the current president, Mr. Zelensky, being in power. Now let's look at one more thing here. Here's a Government of Ukraine webpage talking about giving a benefit or a financial assistance to victims of the war. We get the Google Translate version here, and so what it's saying is 1,000 of the Ukrainian currency each to all completely vaccinated Ukrainians. So only if you've received the COVID-19 vaccine can you get financial support in the middle of a war. If we look down a bit further here, we can see a bit more detail who can get financial aid. Citizens of Ukraine age 14 and over with a full course of vaccination and have a green COVID certificate in the action application. So perhaps this sheds a little bit more light on what sort of government are we promoting, what are Western values. A government that will only help citizens who are victims of war if they've received a full course of COVID-19 vaccination. Now, that said, certainly not all, probably not even the majority of Ukrainians are in support of the very evil deeds of the UPA or things like the Azov Battalion or people like the young lady that NATO tweeted out wearing a Sonnenrad. But I point these things out to show that these are the type of people that the Ukrainian government is willing to work with and who our government is all of a sudden willing to work with. Not too long ago, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was angrily denouncing people in the House of Commons who, quote, stood with Nazi symbols in respect to one lone individual out of tens, if not hundreds of thousands who had a Nazi symbol on a sign. To him, that completely wiped out all merit to the Freedom Convoy. Yet now he's actually giving firearms and anti-tank weapons and all kinds of support to people who stand with those who clearly display Nazi symbols. Once again, this is an example of, well, it's not selective enforcement because there's nothing to be enforced on Ukraine, but another term I heard recently is repressive tolerance, where if you're on the quote-unquote right side, or the side that agrees with the Liberal Party of Canada, you can get away with anything. If you oppose them, you can't even get away with jaywalking. Now, finally, I said I want to give a couple of considerations in a hypothetical situation. What if something like this was happening with the United States? I mean, simply, let's look at a bit of the background here. I don't believe this is particularly controversial. I mean, I actually heard this discussed on CBC where they had an expert on talking about the war in the Ukraine, is that prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was an agreement between the United States and Russia that NATO would not move into former Warsaw Pact countries, and especially the Ukraine. Now, as we know, many former Warsaw Pact countries have joined NATO, such as Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. However, Ukraine is of a special concern to the Russians because it's within such a distance of Moscow that NATO could put nuclear weapons in the Ukraine, and they could be launched and destroy Moscow before Russia would have a time to react. So one can see why the Russian government might be concerned by that. I think it's worth considering, what would the United States do if Russia were trying to make an agreement or an alliance with Mexico that would involve putting Russian troops and Russian nuclear missiles on Mexican soil? In my view, there's no question whatsoever that the United States would invade Mexico to prevent that, and we have historical precedent for that when you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that's essentially what the United States was threatening before the Soviet Union backed down. And I'm not an expert in international law, but from what I do know, preemptive wars are actually allowed in international law. That's what the US used to justify the invasion of Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom. So if it's okay for the United States, if we're using the same standards for everyone, it would be possibly legal for Russia. Now again, I'm not an apologist for Russia. I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin. He was a colonel in the KGB, a nefarious, evil communist organization that oppressed their own people and spied on other countries. I certainly don't trust someone with that background, but again, as a defense lawyer and just as a person, I believe that one needs to look at all the facts, and one can also feel sorrow at the real human tragedy that's happening in Ukraine, but still insist on there being some truth and some objectivity and some consistency. So this video is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, call a lawyer. You can call another lawyer or myself. My phone number and website are listed below. If there's topics you'd like to see me cover on this channel, please send an email to the email address listed below or leave a comment in the comment section. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please like, share, subscribe, and consider following us on social media.